how comfortable are you with JavaScript? And what about CSS? The goal for me here is to give you some tools to become more comfortable working with some of these technologies and point out some important gotchas that maybe you're not aware of. Maybe you've seen this meme around the internet. It's so appropriate to what CSS is and how we feel sometimes with CSS. We're working with it, we're doing things with it, and it's not quite doing what we expect it to do. But don't let that shy you away from CSS. I mean, really, CSS is awesome. You know, it's a great technology with a lot of very scary quirks, really annoying problems. But if something is going to be key for working with CSS is understanding that everything in CSS is a box. And box, you can think of it as a rectangle or just this four-sided element, right? Everything, all your HTML becomes a box. And I think the biggest issue we all have with CSS and when it doesn't do what we want is due to what something called CSS specificity. And towards the end, we're going to talk more about that. Well, first, let's focus a little bit on JavaScript. JavaScript runs the web. There's no website now, or you'll be hard-pressed to find a website that doesn't require CSS, JavaScript in some way or form. Of course, there's some websites that don't need it, but they're probably very static. It is an interpreted language, and as of this year, the browser support is fabulous, right? JavaScript really runs on all browsers. It used to be that sometimes people wanted to disable JavaScript on their browsers. Well, those days, I think they're in the past. JavaScript is something that we need to embrace and we need to use on a lot of our projects. However, something that I want to get out of the way, I read this tweet where we really touches on a key point. JavaScript is not the same as Java. Okay, so remember this: Java is to JavaScript as ham is to hamster. That's more or less the relationship. All right, so don't confuse Java with JavaScript. With that out of the way, let's touch on some JavaScript and PL SQL things. So in JavaScript, we're going to have an assignment operator that is our equal sign, but in PL SQL, the plain equal sign, that's the equality operator. So if we want to find if something's equal to something, we do a simple equal sign. And this will bite us a lot when we're coding in PL SQL and then we switch to JavaScript. The equality, the assignments are in PL SQL is the 2: equal. Great. That's going to fail if we try to use that on JavaScript. But the equal will work just fine in JavaScript. However, what it means is that we're doing an assignment. So often we may do some if condition where we do I equals 1, but we're not really doing an equal in JavaScript when I have a single equal. See, that's the assignment operator. So what we're really saying when we write something like this is if 1, which becomes a true statement. So this if will always execute. And that's because in JavaScript, when we make an assignment, we get back the value from that assignment. And that's what gets used in the if statement. Whereas in PL SQL, well, this is really our equality operator, so we don't have that problem there. So talking about equality, you may have noticed sometimes you may see the 3 equals or the not equal with a not and 2 equals. You may have seen those equality operators in JavaScript, but you've also may have seen what I like to call the evil twins, the 2 equals or the not equal. Why are these the evil twins? Well, it has to do with how JavaScript handles data types. Look at this list for some example. if you have nothing equal to 0, okay, that's false, but 0 equal to an empty string, that's true. Well, and that's because what JavaScript ends up doing is when we only have the two equals, it will convert one of the values to the other data type automatically without much warning. So you can see some of these are really strange. I mean, you get false equal to false as a string. Okay, that's false. But if you have false equal to a 0 as a string, that's true. And that's because this 0 gets converted to a number, and 0 is the same as false in JavaScript. So you get this really weird situations. And that's why using the strict equality is what the three equals operator, the strict equality, are a much better option for the way we normally think of data types. Because that's exactly what it is in PL SQL. In PL SQL, a single equal for equality is going to be closer related in JavaScript to the three operator, the three equals. Same thing for not equal. That would be equivalent to our not equal or our less than, greater than operators. Moving on to other interesting things. So in JavaScript, our OR operator is two pipes. But in PL SQL, that's our concatenation operator. So what we really need to do in JavaScript is do a plus sign to concatenate. But what makes matters a little complex is that the plus sign is also used for addition in JavaScript. So this again leads to some quirks. Whereas if we add 0 plus 0, yes, we get 0. But if we have it as a string, this gets converted to a string. We're concatenating. Or two strings, it's what we would expect. We're concatenating strings. But this one, again, the string wins instead of the number. We still get a concatenation. So we got to be very careful how we use those. Let's point out another operator, the increment value, and for the plus plus will be our increment value, and minus minus our decrease value. So you may have seen these. So this is equivalent to just adding a 1 to a variable. We do v, we assign v plus 1 to v again. That's equivalent to doing the v plus plus. But it does matter where you place the operator, after or before. So in this example, this I equal 5, I will be a 6. And in this case, I would also be a 6. However, the results are different. So think about this for a moment. So we have a 6 plus 4. And here, do we really have a 6 plus 4, or do we have a 5 plus 4 for the operation? So the way it's going to work is when it's before, the value that is used for the next operator is the new result. So the I gets incremented to 6 here, and then we add 4. So then we get the 10. And in both cases, you can see the I is still going to be a 6. But in this case, first, we're going to use the value of I as is. So it's going to be a 5 plus 4. That will give us a 9. And then I would still be a 6. So be very careful with this when you use the plus plus. Or minus minus for that matter. Let's talk about functions in JavaScript. So functions are the heart of things in JavaScript. Everything is a function. In PL SQL, if you have a let's say we have this function, and if you have a keen eye, you may realize that what's wrong with this function is I don't have a return value. So this function will compile, right? But when I try to execute, I'm going to get a function return without value. So what we really need is a return. And we always need to have that explicit return statement to return a value from a PL SQL function. Not so with JavaScript. It is perfectly okay for the JavaScript function to not have an explicit return of value. So it may return nothing, and JavaScript doesn't really have the concept of procedures. Everything is a function. Of course, if you have a function that doesn't return a value, well, that's probably what we understand as a procedure. Also, JavaScript will have flexible parameters. If we have a function that receives two parameters, x and y, well, we can call it with two parameters. That's valid. But guess what? You could call it with more than two, and that is valid as well. The other two are simply not used. And it's also okay to call it with less, but our value here, our multiplication, will return what's called a not a number constant. That is a JavaScript constant. So it's not really an error condition per se. I mean, it's probably you could argue that it's a bug in our code if we do that, but it's a valid syntax. Basically, the second parameter is undefined, so it becomes a not a number when the y is undefined. That makes sense? I should point out also there's ways to access those extra parameters and do some sort of dynamic looping through multiple parameters. So there's a way to make that happen in JavaScript as well. But that's a little more advanced topic. Also, this is very interesting. We can define a function as function and name parameters, and it does something. But this is also a function. We declare a variable, and we assigned a function to it. And that is perfectly valid in JavaScript as well. If we use the type of operator in JavaScript, we can ask what type is foo, and it will tell us, yep, it's a function, all right. You may have seen the eval operator or primitive in JavaScript. And now we know that this is a big security risk. Eval will take some string and basically convert it to code. This is the equivalent to an execute immediate in PL SQL. The problem with eval is that it has no security checks. It could execute all sorts of code. If whatever you're passing to it, it doesn't really get validated. It's not sandboxed. It's a dangerous call to make in our code. So in general, unless you have a really good reason and you can really sanitize everything that is being passed to it, I'm gonna say just stay away from eval. And today, any example you see will probably avoid eval. But in the past, it was a popular recommendation to just use the eval primitive. So be aware of that. If you find an older post, let's say 5-10 years ago, yeah, an older, you will see eval mentioned. There's so much about JavaScript that I could keep talking, right? It's really almost not fair to call this webinar to be JavaScript and CSS and expect to be experts on anything. So I'm trying to point out as many things as possible. And now let's switch gears a little and talk about CSS. At the beginning, I said that everything is a box, and our biggest problem would be specificity. So in CSS and HTML in general, we're going to have the concept of the box model. Everything will have, any HTML element will have some content. The content could be empty, but it still has the concept that it will have some content. Then there will be what's called the padding, then the border, and then a margin. All of them could be empty, but these are the attributes of any HTML element. To the point that in the inspectors, if I right-click my element and I inspect, I'm going to go here to compute it. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. You can see that box model. So here's my content. Here's the size of the content. That's an image. That's why I can highlight it. and then it has no padding, it has no border, it has no margin. But those are the elements that are around any element that I may select on the screen. All of them have that. So let's do some examples here. And the colors are for demonstration purposes. There's nothing setting this content to green, but imagine I have a div element. My div element will have the word content as its content. So that gives me a box. And let's say I have some CSS that's defining the width, 320 pixels, and the height to 50 pixels. So not perfectly a scale, but imagine that this is the box that we end up with, right? Now, if this box had some padding, the gray is there just to make it stand out. But this 10 pixels is all around, 10 pixels in the bottom, on the right, on the top, on the left, just 10 pixels all around of padding. Padding makes an element bigger. It's like putting layers when it's cold and you put in more jackets on, and you put a sweater and a coat and other things and more t-shirts. Well, those make us bigger in size. That is our padding. But then after the padding, we have a border. Think of the border as an outline that is all around that element. And in this case, I'm saying it's 5 pixels all around, bottom, to the right, to the bottom, to the left, to the top. And it's solid, as a solid line, and it's a gray line. So that would be that color, that gray line. And then finally, we're going to have margin. And margin is the space between other elements. If we want elements to not touch each other, really this margin wouldn't be white and it wouldn't be dotted. I'm just trying to exemplify that this padding adds 7 pixels all around the element before it can touch something else. Okay. So if we have a size for the content, padding, border, and margin, if we wanted to know how wide or how tall something is, we need to add all the elements. So in this case, notice that I made the margin 0. So if we have something that's 320 and we have 10 for padding and 5 pixels for border, what's my total width? 320, 330, and 335? No, it's actually, remember this padding is all around. So we're going to have 320, 10, 10 for the left and 10 for the right, and then a 5 of the border, 5 for the left, 5 for the right, 0 margin, and our total is 350. Make sense? So any element will know their size based on all those attributes. Same thing for the height. So I'm throwing at you some CSS declarations here, but let's break it down. Our first section is our selector. What is it that we're selecting? And then we're going to have properties, and we're going to set the properties to different values. Okay. Now, this selector, also think of it in Apex. We're going to see in dynamic actions, for example, we can see this jQuery selector. So it is not just a CSS selector. Understanding this selector syntax will also help us with dynamic actions when we're selecting specific elements. So we have a question. How do you associate the div with the div content? Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to get into right now. I'm going to start explaining how these selectors get associated with, let's go back to this content, right? How do I associate this to this? That's, if I understand correctly, that's the question. Well, we're going to get right into that. Let me show you some other things, and then we'll understand those associations of div and selectors and different names. First, let me talk about these properties. When you see padding 10 pixels, that's a shorthand for really saying 10, 10, 10, 10. And how do you know which one is what side of the box? Well, think of a watch, and we're always going to go in clockwise, and we're going to start with the top. So the first 10 pixels, the first value, that's the top. Then we're going to do the right, the bottom, and the left. Always top, right, bottom, left. And that's something you will be well suited to memorize when you see those 4 values. Now, sometimes you'll see only 2 values. If you have 2 values, the first one will be the top and the bottom. And the next one will be the left and right. So it's kind of nice how it's organized. You have top, left, bottom, right, in that the first one would be top and bottom. The second will be left and right. And of course, if we have a single value, it's all around. But we can also get very specific with these properties. We can break it into padding for the top, padding for the right, bottom and left, and so on. So doing this breakout tells us that we can override other elements. See, when we're working with something like the universal theme, elements, certain elements like regions will come with some predefined padding, margin, and borders. We can override specific aspects of it by using the more surgical values, the direct approach to the padding on the top, the padding on the right, bottom, or left. So let's talk about selectors, and this will touch more on the question we had a moment ago. First, selectors, it's similar to our where clause on a SQL statement. It's what are we looking for? Okay, so this would be it's our where clause is what do we look for inside a table. What I want you to imagine is that a web page is your table. All the HTML elements on a page, those make up the rows on a table. Okay, so really CSS Selector is about searching something in your HTML page. For example, the star selector will select everything on a page. Let's do a very quick, drastic example. If I open my elements here, I'm going to create a new rule. So you can do F12 to open the inspector. I could have done a right click and click inspect. I'm on a Mac, so I can do a Command Option J to just open and close, and then I'll switch to elements. So there's a few ways to get to our inspector. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click plus to add a new rule. And my rule is going to be the star. So now I'm selecting everything on the page. And I'm going to do a border of 1 pixel around every element. But to really see it, we got to say this border is solid. You see how it all showed up? Every single element gets a border. And I could say, make it red. I'm going to close this. So you can see how every single element, and the reason I have some are very thick is because there's multiple boxes around some of these elements, right? That's why they get a little bit thicker. So this selected everything on the page with this star selector. And then we apply something to the elements. Often we'll want to select by ID. So selecting by ID is similar to doing a select by primary key. We all know that this is an efficient way of finding something by primary key, right? So in our page, the IDs are the notation we're gonna use is it's a hash sign, right? We put a hash and a value, a name for the ID. This is how we select the ID of an element, and then we give it some values. So let's do an example. Let's say I have this div with an ID called emps and a class, and this class happens to be one of the classes that are used in the universal theme. Okay, so I have this information. To select by ID, I'm going to do the hash and emps. This will switch to red anything, any text that is inside this div. That's how I select by ID. Let's do another example. Select by class. By class, we're going to use a dot for a class name. This would be equivalent to searching by some other attribute, right? So we'll do a dot and the class name, and then we'll have our attributes. So getting back to this example, if I want to select everything with the class, we'll do a dot and the class name. Notice that the class does not have a dot, but for a selector, we'll place the dot to indicate that is what we want to select. We want to select by class. And it's worth mentioning that there can be many elements on the page that have this class. So this really can apply to many elements, not just a single one. Here's another way to select. Sometimes we'll have other things like attributes. In this case, this attribute is called headers, but headers, it could be many different types of attributes. So we can find an attribute by using this square bracket notation. So we're going to have the element, in this case TD. This TD is an element. So I'm just going to select the TD elements. I'm going to put the brackets. I'm going to have the name of the attribute and the name of the header. So this will find any attribute with that header. There's other operators other than the equal. The one we may want to use a lot is this first one. This is matches any word. So it could have empno or it could have other names. And there are others that match at the beginning. This would be at the beginning. This would be at the end. There's starts with, ends with. So there's a few others. And when I needed something different, I kind of just search for it. Just be aware that there's many operators to use here. So let's see, we have some questions. How do you find out what properties attributes are defined for an element? Oh, great question. So to find out what attributes and elements are defined for an element, and that's where CSS gets a little frustrating. But what you're going to do is inspect an element. So I'm going to right click on something. I'm going to select inspect. And the right side is all the CSS styles that are being applied. Here's the one I added manually, right? The pixel, but here's the color. Here's where it gets a color. If I turn this off, my links are changing to a different color. And I could even set it to green. And then you see that all my links are changing to green. So there isn't a place where you see everything all together. You basically see it as a bunch of rules, all the rules that are being applied, this rule, that rule, and so on. So if I switch to a different element, this changes. And if I switch to a different element, this changes as well. So that's how we're going to find what things are being applied. Can we have multiple attributes? Absolutely. So we're going to get now into multiple attributes in our CSS classes. So let's get to more examples. So selecting by element, and this means by HTML element. So when we select by HTML element, that's the example I started with, that div. We simply place the name of the element. So it could be a div, it could be a span, it could be a TD for table data, it could be the word table for a table. Any HTML element, you simply just write the name to select it. So in this case, our selector would simply be div, and that will find any div in our page, and it will set the content of the text to red. So let's do some examples here. Let's say that I have all of this CSS selected. By class, I'm going to set the background color of this div to white. But by ID, I'm going to set it to gray. And by element, I'm going to set it to blue. So the question to you, and you can use the chat if you want to play along, what background color is this div going to receive? White, gray, or blue? There's a few ways to think about this. The background color could be blue because that's the last one that we define. It could be gray because we're going by ID, or it could be white because it's the first one selected. I got no chat input so far. Nobody's playing along. That's all right. Gray is going to win. The background color of this div is going to be gray because the ID, it's a higher precedence than class or by element. So it doesn't matter the order in which we define them, the ID will win when we're looking at class and element. The ID will be more specific. And we're starting to understand the concept of CSS specificity. So this is something that will frustrate us a lot when we're trying to override the color or an attribute on something. Maybe our CSS is not specific enough. Let's look at another example. In this one, I have two attributes being set for the class. So what background color is my div going to be? Is it going to be white or gray? And will it have a border? Well, it will have a border, right? Because there's nothing in the other rule that overrides the border. So this border will take. That's not a concern in this type of rule. But we will get the gray because that's the second rule that we're defining. So first the browser will say, okay, it's going to be white. And then when we specify exactly the same type of selector, the same type of rule, the gray will override the previous one. So there is something about the order. The order will be important. What about this one? Now notice that I've added this style attribute to green. So what color is my div going to be? Green, white, gray, or blue? And this one, I guess I'm introducing a new concept here. This one I'm actually using, and that is a valid class in universal theme, by the way, but I'm actually combining two classes. Two classes get combined by just simply writing dot and the next class name. So this is a two-class assignment. So in this case, we're going to get a green because the style, it's a higher, adding a style in line to an element is the higher precedence, higher than a single class, higher than two classes together, and even higher than an ID. So in this case, green will win. Oh, I do see some people are commenting on the questions. Thank you, Millie, for pointing that out. Great, thank you. I'm gonna watch for those. Good job, guys, answering some of those. So CSS specificity is a set of rules that will let us understand why we're getting frustrated with the CSS we're trying to apply. We just learned that the style attribute would be the most specific, then the ID, then class and attribute are at the same level, then element is the least specific. That's the order of specificity. Now, there's more to it. You basically want to count how many style attributes assignments you have, although style attributes, we normally just have one. The ID would get a 1. If we have classes, pseudo classes, or attributes, we'll count how many and we'll put a number, and elements and we'll put a number. So basically, you fill out the numbers here, and whatever has the biggest numeric value here would be the rule that will win. I don't know if that makes sense. So you count how many style you have in place. So let me go back to this one. In this case, style is 1. Then you can count, for example, classes. I have 2 classes. So in this example, here under class, I would put a 2 in here because there's 2 classes. If we had an ID specified, we'd put a 1 here. So you enter the numbers, and whatever number this reads to be bigger, that's going to be the rule that wins. Yeah, so the question here is inline more specific than ID or class? Yes, absolutely. So inline, this style attribute, that's the inline. That is the most specific. That trumps all the other ones. So let's look at this example now. And now I'm actually looking at your answers. What background color are we going to get? And I'm going to point out the trick here. I'm using the important. So up until now, we learned that inline would be more important. So you would think that green is the biggest. But this one has an important declarative value there. So important will trump everything else. The automatic win would be to use important. However, I'm going to invite you to reconsider using important for everything. That's your atomic bomb solution. If you start using important for everything, then you're fighting all your importance. So try to avoid the important, although sometimes, I gotta say it, sometimes you're trying to override something, you add important, boom, that's your automatic win. So keep that in mind. Where do we place CSS in Apex? Well, there's many places we can put our CSS attributes. One is we can edit a page. You scroll down to the CSS section, and if you have your CSS on a file, you can do the file URL right there, or you can put it in line, and then you can add all your CSS elements there. And you can see here how I have prepared name is getting fixed to 500 pixels. These are attributes I'm adding to a report. I'm saying that my full name and my entry date are not wrapping. I don't want them to wrap. And I'm saying that this class is going to be in line with a margin. And there's a lot more stuff in here. We just don't see it. But these attributes, because I'm on a specific page, they're only for that page. Every other page will be unaffected by these rules. So that's one place we can place our CSS in a file or in line right on the page. This is very useful for page-specific CSS, items, buttons, CSS overrides that we're trying to do from universal theme or whatever template we're working with. Assign it to specific report columns. We can find them and change them. So that's where it'll be very useful. The other place you'll want to do it is in the theme roller. There's a custom CSS section. So if I go to an application, I'm going to click here on my developer toolbar, the theme roller. You open the theme roller. Yeah, okay, great. Something happened to this, got expired. Yep. Of course it did. But you open the theme roller. You open the theme roller, and there's a custom CSS section. You open that up, and you're going to have some CSS that you can enter in there. The nice thing about this CSS is that it's going to be available to all pages. It also gets minimized. Whatever you enter there, all the extra spaces, they get eliminated to make it as small as possible so that when it downloads through the network is taken up as the least amount of bytes as possible. And it's very fast and easy to update. So that's a very nice approach. The con to this is that it's lost when you switch styles, right? It's specific to that style. Not that we do that often, but just keep that in mind. And because of that, I like to maintain that CSS on a file, regardless, right? Even though I'm copy pasting it into my custom CSS in the theme roller, I like to maintain it on a file so I can do version control on it. All right, let me check some of the questions. What will be the most specific, efficient way, file, URL, or inline. Okay, so the question is, what's the most efficient way via file or URL? So we're talking about this, in a file or right inline in the CSS. Well, most efficient, it kind of depends. Purely efficiency, I guess it depends on how we define efficiency. If you do it by file, the file can be cached by the browser. So in that regard, it doesn't have to be downloaded every single time. However, if I'm going to have one or two rules, which is, or just a handful of little rules that I have for a specific page, I don't see any problem with doing it in line, because I'm not going to have a whole file just for page 300 when I only have one or two rules. Now, if they're global, or if I'm going to use them over and over in other pages, then absolutely, I'll put it on a file, or I'll put it here in the theme roller. And there's another approach. And before that, let me check the other questions. TH prepared name will only work. Okay, so somebody's commenting about this CSS I have right there. TH prepared name. So in this case, let me read the whole question before I. TH prepared name will only work with a tag with the ID of prepared name. Correct. If something on my page has an ID of prepared name, and this prepared name is specified, we control that by specifying a static ID on our report columns. So we can control that. Let me log in here and show you that specific page. My report has a prepared name column in it, and once you set a prepared name column, well, in this case, this is a classic report. So classic reports are very specific in that the name of the column gets added as an ID to the header. That TH we see here, they get added directly. For interactive reports, and let me go to a different page. For interactive reports, we get to specify that ID. So this one's interactive. Here's prepared name. And right here, there's a static ID that we specify. So I'm keeping it simple. I'm calling my static ID exactly the same as my column, which is the behavior of the classic report. And that will generate an HTML that says TH with that ID. Hope that helps. All right. So there's a third way to specify our CSS, global user interface file. We're going to go to Share Components, User Interface Attributes. We're going to edit our user interface. And you're going to scroll down to the cascading style sheets, which, by the way, that's, if I didn't mention it, that's what CSS stands for, cascading style sheets. And you can specify a file right there. So let me give you the example here. I'm going to go to Share Components. I'm going to go to User Interface Attributes. You can edit your user interface. And I'm going to scroll down to my CSS element. Now, in this case, I use Apex Nitro, so I have a substitution string to specify my path. So if you don't know about Apex Nitro, there's some YouTube videos that you can watch on that. It's a great tool that allows me to work really well with CSS and JavaScript. But this could be a app images token substitution string that finds my image and reference that. So I'm not going to save that. So going back to this, you can upload it as a static application file or static workspace file. or you can put it on your server. Either way, then you just reference either both for JavaScript and for CSS. You can specify these files that are going to be available to every single page in your application. So this, for bigger projects, this is really the better way to manage your CSS. You put it on a file and you make it global to the whole application. Other questions, comments? And while you're typing something, I'm going to show you this files, for example, or this app files. So let me go to, give me a second. I'm going to open an editor. And some questions are coming in. That's great. All right. Let me look at the questions that are coming in. Question, when you inspect an element in a browser, some attributes are crossed out. Oh, great question. What's the difference, and some are not. What's the difference between crossed out and what is overwritten later? That's a great question. Let's go to the application. And I'm going to just inspect some element. So as I inspect some elements, there's a few things to notice here. For example, this is coming right out of what Universal Theme will do. This file is from my style, and it's a modification of the theme roller. And everything that's gray is because it doesn't apply to the element that is highlighted. So this input element that's highlighted, the gray stuff doesn't apply. The black stuff does apply, but everything together is the rule. And what you see here is that there's a comma for each rule. So this class, or that's what the comma will do, or this other class, or some other class, or some other class. So this element does fit this attribute of type text, and it's going to get those attributes set. Now, the crossed out, let's see, like this one, there's something higher up that it's going to override the elements crossed out. I think this border radius is better. So the default core.min.css, that's the base core file that Apex adds to all our applications. It says that our border radius is 2 pixels, but that's crossed out because somewhere up here, well, in this case, it got defined to exactly the same thing, but this is a more specific rule that is setting it to 2 again. And I could have an even more specific rule. Let's see, border radius, 5 pixels. So now when I do this 5 pixels, now I added it here in line, but normally if it was loaded this way, this would be crossed out because something more specific will kill that rule. And in Inspector, you can also turn it on and off as well, manually, just to make it take effect. That's a very good question. Is this going to override CSS and templates? I'm not sure what that was selecting. Okay, so yes, we are overriding all that CSS we're specifying is overriding the CSS on the template. So the CSS from the template comes from this file and the style file, and our own file will override those. Are there any APIs for Apex to use for CSS and JavaScript? Ooh, mine. Yes, there are. However, they're more for manipulating the file. So there's an Apex JavaScript, There's an Apex CSS, and they are used mostly when we work with plugins. I think that's all I can get into that for that question. What happens if we have two importance on the same attribute? If you have two importance on the same attribute, the last one will take place. Okay, and that's the problem with using a lot of importance. Then you're trying to figure out which one is first and which one gets added second. Sometimes after switching the included legacy JavaScript to yes, the JavaScript starts conflicting with each other under different scenarios. Is there a quick fix for this issue? All right, with universal theme, let's this is a complicated topic, so I'm just going to say, and we're talking about, let me go to, let me show you the element we're talking about. Include legacy JavaScript. So older applications created before the universal theme will have what's called legacy JavaScript that is now being eliminated because it's not really required. So I'm just going to say, if you create a brand new application with universal theme, this would be a no, and just don't switch it to yes. That's it. That's simple. Now, if you're converting your application from an older theme into universal theme, you may need to keep this yes, because you may be using JavaScript that's now is now considered legacy. There's no easy way to deal with this. I'm sorry. I think basically you just have to, I would always err on the side of setting it to no when I upgrade an app, and see what things are failing, what JavaScript things were legacy, and try to rewrite them to something new. If that's not possible, then you really have to go case by case. So that might be a little complex. Form item, the other question, form item has 3 places where you can set CSS classes. Column, appearance, advanced, what is the difference? Well, there's going to be declarative attributes for a column to set. CSS should be your last approach. First go with the declarative changes. Use the column appearance, use the advanced. Try to do declarative changes first, always. Really, the CSS approach will be when you want to do something that is not available declaratively. And of course, there's always also the template options, which is totally different topic that we're not going to get into right now. But let me select an item. So when I select an item, you're going to have this template options, and depending on the version of Apex 5.1 will have more, but I could set, make it large, make it extra large, and all that is, it's set in CSS, or stretch the item. There might be other elements here as well. Maybe if I select an attribute, if I select a region, we'll see more. See those elements. All those, when I change template options, more CSS is being used. Classes are being added to the element, and it translates to CSS. That's all template options do. Is it possible to debug CSS? Well, yeah, that's exactly what inspecting does, right? You inspect it, and then you start making changes, turning off, turning on elements. Let me go back to the application so that it's a little bit easier here. So basically, you start turning on and off an element. You can even change it right there. You can say, well, I'm going to go with green. And of course, that's going to make, you can see how that element changed and this element changed right here, because I'm just changing it. If I refresh the page, I'm just do Command R, Control R if you're in Windows, it just reloads the page, and that CSS goes away. So you're basically prototyping your changes right on the inspector. Aside from going step by step debugging, no, not to my knowledge. I don't think there's a way to do step by step debugging with CSS. And that's what makes it frustrating, right? Question, if we upload JavaScript file in the workspace, and when we run the page, which uses that JS, sometimes it stores it in cache memory. How do you overcome this issue? Okay, so this would be probably the last question. We're getting close to the end. How do we overcome the issue of the file being cached when you upload it? Well, in Apex 5 and 5.1, there's a great enhancement that when you upload files, they get a version number in the path, and that's transparent to us. We simply specify app images or workspace images, substitution string, and Apex will expand that to use a version number in it. So actually, in the newer versions now, this is not a problem. Every time you change it, that version number changes automatically whenever you upload something. But one approach to overcome that, if you don't have access to, if you're not on Apex 5.1, is, let me show you, let me go to page 1. Oops. One technique is to specify, let me make this bigger, to add this fake parameter to our file. Question mark v equal the app version. And then you change your application version to force a change. That's a common technique. And that app version, it's in your application properties. I'm going to go here, application properties, and right there. So that value will be added there as a parameter. All right, guys. I think we're towards the end here. Again, my name is Jorge Rimblas. You can find the slides if you go to rimblas.com blog presentation. You will receive an email with the recording of this webinar. So you'll be able to go back to different areas and look at it. And you can always send me a tweet and send me questions or comments at Rimblas on Twitter.